We tend to think of history as this solid, unchanging thing, right? A set of facts. But what if it's not? What if it's more like a story that a nation tells about itself? Today, we're going to dig into how two of the world's closest allies, the US and the UK, can look at the very same moment in time and come away with two completely different histories.
And it all started with this one single quote from a casual chat in a London pub. An American brings up the War of 1812, a huge, defining conflict in their history books. And to the Brit, it's just a vague memory, a footnote to a much, much bigger war. That jarring difference, that's our jumping-off point.
So that's the big question we're tackling. This isn't about figuring out who was right or who was wrong. It's about trying to understand why. Why do these different memories exist, and what does that tell us about who we think we are? Let's start with the conflicts that forged America. For the United States, these wars are the main quest, the epic origin story. But if you look at it from across the Atlantic, they look a lot more like a side quest. I mean, the difference in perspective here is just massive. In the US, the War of 1812 is the Second War of Independence. It's the conflict that gave them their national anthem. But for Britain at the time, the real war, the one that threatened their very existence, was against Napoleon. This American thing was seen as an expensive, annoying distraction while they were literally trying to save Europe. So a huge trigger for the war was this practice of impressment. Now, American history books often paint this as straight-up kidnapping on the high seas, but the British had a totally different legal view. To them, they weren't kidnapping Americans, they were reclaiming their own sailors, deserters who had bailed during a desperate war. Now, that doesn't make it right, but it changes the motive from pure villainy to a really complicated legal mess. And this is where that simple American story of being the victim gets a lot more complicated. The US actually invaded Canada first, thinking they'd be hailed as liberators. They weren't. American soldiers burned the Parliament in what's now Toronto before the British ever laid a finger on the White House. So from the British side, torching Washington wasn't some random act of aggression, it was payback. Okay, let's talk about the big one, the American Revolution. The American version is a classic, a heroic fight for freedom against a tyrannical foreign king. But in Britain, it was seen as a tragic and really messy civil war. Not a nation being born, but a family tearing itself apart. It wasn't a foreign war, it was a domestic crisis. And this is so crucial to remember. A huge chunk of the people living in the colonies, the Loyalists, did not want independence. We're talking hundreds of thousands of people. These folks were often terrorized, their property was seized, and in the end, many were forced to flee as refugees. This wasn't some unified uprising, it was America's first civil war. All right, now we have to get into the really uncomfortable stuff. Every nation tells a story about its moral compass, but when we actually compare the timelines on one of the biggest moral issues of the 19th century, well, the picture gets pretty cloudy. This timeline is just stark. The United States was founded on this incredible idea that all men are created equal, but it took them almost 90 years and a horrific civil war to finally abolish slavery. Britain, the so-called tyranny America rebelled against, did it peacefully, more than 30 years earlier. So how did Britain manage to do it peacefully? Well, basically, they paid for it. The government took out an absolutely enormous loan, not to free the slaves, but to compensate the slave owners, to get them to agree and avoid a war. The cost was a mind-boggling £20 million. And to put that number in perspective, that single loan was 40% of the entire country's budget for the year. Think about that. It was a staggering financial gamble to push abolition through without everything falling apart. And here's the absolute kicker. That debt was so huge that British taxpayers only finished paying it off in 2015. Yeah, 2015. A decision made in the 1830s was still being paid for in the 21st century. And this wasn't just something people noticed later. Right from the very beginning, British critics were pointing out what they saw as this massive hypocrisy. They were asking how the American founders could demand their own freedom while holding hundreds of thousands of people in bondage. Okay, let's jump forward to the 20th century, because how we remember our country's role in the big global conflicts, especially World War II, is a massive piece of our modern identity. So, the American story of World War II, the one we all know from the movies, it usually starts right here,
in December 1941, the U.S. swoops in to save the day. But this timeline shows the British reality. For more than 2 incredibly brutal years, they were in it, fighting, often standing almost completely alone against the Nazis. Now, no one in Britain denies that American entry was absolutely essential for victory, but there is this deep-seated frustration with the Hollywood version of the story. They remember the Blitz, the rationing, the constant terror, and they also remember that the famous Lend-Lease program wasn't just a gift. Britain had to pay for those supplies, selling off its assets to buy the very tools it needed to survive. So, after looking at all these clashing memories, we've got to come back to our big question. Why? Why do we tell ourselves these completely different stories about the exact same past? Well, it really all comes down to the kind of hero each nation wants to be in its own movie. The American story is all about freedom, rebellion, the underdog. It's heroic, and it's designed to build this identity of being special, of being exceptional. The British story, it's much more stoic. It's about stability, endurance, getting the job done. It's a story meant to reinforce an identity of resilience. And that right there is the most important thing to take away from all of this. History isn't just a dusty record of events. It's an active, living story. It's the myth we create to explain to ourselves who we are and why we matter. So, I'll leave you with a question to chew on. Knowing that history is a story we choose to tell, what's the main theme of your country's story? And maybe even more important, who or what is being left out of the script?